So welcome to this session at DynamicsCon, and I would like to start by thanking everyone who has voted for my session, and also to the DynamicsCon people for letting me do this session. We're going to talk today about Dynamics 365 Finance and Operations Microservices. And my name is Johan Persson. I'm a senior technical specialist at a company in Sweden called Engage Group. We are a small specialist company who tend to help customers implement Dynamics from the customer end. During the session, I will not be able to answer any questions, so please leave them in the chat, and just we will do a Q&A at the end of the session. So let's get started. First of all, what are microservices? So microservices is basically an architecture where we try to split a big software solution into minor parts. So there are a couple of levels here. First of all, we have a classic monolithic application. You could probably look at like the traditional AX 2012, where everything is included into a big software package, and all of the functionality is in the same place. Then we have like componentized applications. Those are applications that we have actually broken down into smaller software. We are still working towards like a common database, but at least we don't have like one large software binary to work with in this case. And the latest now is to use something called microservices. So microservices are smaller units that are easier to maintain. You can update them individually, and they are connected through well-defined interfaces. So just because you update one of the units, you don't have to update all of them. As long as you keep the interfaces intact, everything should be fine. I mean, there are of course reasons why it might not be, but normally everything should be fine, and you should be able to just switch one of those out and keep running with the new ones as well. So there are a couple of ways to do this. You could either have them talk to a database, have their own database, as you can see here, microservice component, and there is a separate database for the microservice. What you can also do is you can keep it completely stateless, so it could actually talk to either not talk to any database, or talk to a common database which acts as an integration component in this case. It could be Dataverse, it could be a Datalake, for instance. It could be if it's a message-based microservice, then you could use Azure Service Bus or a message queue. Yeah, any of those message-based integration services in Azure as well. The whole point of having it stateless is actually that you can scale it out. So if you need better performance from your microservice, you could actually add microservices and have them distributed, which also means that if one of them is crashing, for instance, you could actually just restart that specific microservice and everything else will be working fine. It's just that one is offline, but it has duplicates that continue to work anyway. This might look a bit more complex than having one specific application, but the thing is that since we do have these well-defined interfaces, it's actually less complex because you only have to look into one of the microservices at any given time. And as I said before, if you replace one, you can always just create a new one in that case, or you can update code. And in the Dynamics case, we're actually moving code out of the core product and adding it to an external update in this case. So from an understanding point of view, it might look more complex, but it's actually an easier solution to do this. Another point in this is that you could actually, for some microservices, you could actually spread them out geographically. So you could have one in each data center region, for instance, to get the shortest latency to a specific one, and so on. We also have resilience. As I said before, you could scale them out or you could scale them up. So you could have multiple microservices delivering the same functionality and not really caring about each other. But if one goes down, then you can actually have others coming up, or you can just reboot that one and set it up again. And finally, it's a bit more serviceable. So from a Dynamics perspective, Microsoft can actually update these microservices without thinking about it breaking the customer's or the partner's code in this case. And the customer or partner can actually don't have to think about the actual microservice, because that one will use the predefined interface anyway. So that's a good thing. So is this approach a new one? No, I would say that it's not actually, because I mean we have seen this in AX 2012. We have something in AX 2012 called the AIF, the Application Integration Framework. What some customer did was they actually broke it out from AIF, all of the transformation and the building of files and so on. They actually broke out of the AIF and moved it into like a BizTalk server or a dedicated integration platform of some sort. From the beginning, actually, you choose to have CRM and ERP as separate applications. They could have used them as one application, but they actually choose to have them separate. And if we look at, for instance, the HR functionality in Dynamics, Microsoft actually opted to break to duplicate the HR functionality in Dynamics 365 for Talent or the new one, the new HR components as well. If you look at CRM, Microsoft have broken CRM down into sales, customer engagement, and field service. And another good example of this is actually all the way back in 2012, AX 2012, where Microsoft actually opted to have the retail components, the storefront components moved out of the application for this reason, and also for having local processing in the store in this case. So which Microsoft services are available? So these are the ones that are available right now. They will be adding more of them going forward. There has been added a lot of them, but the first one, of course, is the export to Datalake. This has been in preview for a long time, and it's actually one of the most important ones. I will be talking a bit more about what it actually does. We have the planning optimization, we have IoT intelligence, we have the tax calculation service, finance insights, expense management, electronic invoices, and inventory visibility. And I will go, in the coming slides, I will go through these one by one and just do a quick explanation of what they actually mean and what they do, and some hints about how they are set up and how they are actually using the infrastructure to work with Dynamics. With that being said, I'm not an application consultant, so I won't go into detail on exactly how businesses are going to use this, but I hopefully I can explain it in a way so that everyone understands it anyway. So the first one, export to Datalake. Why is this one important? So first of all, it is replacing the entity store. There is something today in Dynamics called the entity store, and it's actually a separate database available to Dynamics. And in that database, we store aggregate measurements for things such as the built-in Power BI analysis and all of those things. Going forward, Microsoft will eventually replace the internal entity store with this export Datalake. And the good thing here is that it's a more scalable way to do this. Before, we have used the Entity Store, and we've used something called Bring Your Own Database, which is actually an export to an external Azure SQL database. Going forward, we could probably do everything with the Datalake storage, which is also much cheaper than the Azure SQL database. This is especially good for analytics and connecting Azure Synapse and things like that to this data store, just to have it available in reports and so on. But the reason why it's really important is because it actually works as an infrastructure for some of the other services that we're going to go through, because some of them actually use the data lake to connect to Dynamics, which makes it really important anyway. Planning optimization, I guess you have used, some of you have used the resource planning functionality, which has been available in AX 2012, and it was available in Dynamics 365 for Finance and Operations. The MRP was actually deprecated in December 2020 and replaced by this planning optimization. And that means that the MRP is actually not even available in Dynamics anymore. The only way to do master planning is through the planning optimization software. The reason why this is good is that you have a large performance gain. First of all, the actual sessions for doing the planning is a lot faster. It used to take multiple hours. Now we're down to like 15 to 20 minutes in some cases. And also, we are offloading a lot of processing from the core Dynamics 365 instance, which means that it will increase performance even for the core application in this case, which is really, really important. And that is really one of the reasons why Microsoft is moving things out to these microservices. It's also to offload things from the core application. If we look at the IoT intelligence, what that actually does is that it connects Azure IoT Hub to Dynamics using a standard interface, which means that we don't have to do any coding within Dynamics. We don't have to build any X++ code to speak to our IoT devices. We have the IoT devices speak to the Azure IoT Hub, and then we have an interface between the Azure IoT Hub into a specialty to supply chain management components. Today, there are 3 scenarios available: delayed orders, equipment down, and quality anomaly, which means that if you are able to report these scenarios into IoT Hub, we can actually have them available as incoming sensors into supply chain management. And the big thing here is, as I said before, we don't have to build any code to do this. We can surface these sensors directly in Dynamics in this case. The tax calculation service is actually one that I think is also quite interesting, because one of the things I've been arguing for a while is that, for instance, tax reporting is one of these specific things. Tax reporting is, since you're sending tax report to the government has a very specific rule set to do this. It's the same thing with the tax calculations. This is nothing that is unique to one single company. It might be unique to a special type of companies or a special business, but not to an individual company. It should be the same for everyone in a specific branch of business, for instance. Which means that it's actually quite smart to have Microsoft set up these rules in a common engine or a common interface in this case. So both when we talk about electronic invoicing that we will discuss a bit later, and when it comes to tax calculation service. So the point here is to have a standardized service where you set up the rule set for specific companies, for specific streams, and then you use it for all of your companies as a template, sort of. It supports multiple different transactions, so you can have sales order, purchase orders, and different inventory transactions as well to calculate the tax on. It does require an extra component, which is the regulatory configuration service, the RCS, and that's something that you should be using anyway, because it's the replacement for the electronic reporting components that you earlier had in LCS. So once that's set up, you can actually use this, and it's currently in preview, but it is going to be available on most of the continents in the world. So it's actually something that should be a good thing to look into. Finance Insights, it's a fairly new one. It actually predicts cash flow. So it looks at your customer. It sends customer information out to the Azure Datalake, and using a AI engine, it actually looked at the historical data, which means that you do have to have at least a year of historical data available to build and train the model. But once you've done that, you can actually predict which customers will probably be late in paying invoices, which means that you can actually estimate your cash flow. It does require the export to Datalake. As I said, it does require historical data to train the model. You can actually adjust the model. You can actually improve the model directly from the interface and have it use more data. And another interesting thing here, and I did have to talk to my finance consultant about this, but you can actually, using this functionality, create snapshots and compare them to the predictions that the AI engine is creating in this case. Expense management is actually a replacement for the expense management that is in Dynamics today. So if you activate this, it will actually go in and replace the original expense management workplace. And what it actually does is that when you add your expense report and you add a receipt to your expense report, it actually matches the receipt and the expense report with the statements that the company receives from the credit card companies. So it actually reads the scanned receipts, understand what it says, and matches them with the statements, which means that it actually makes it a lot easier to verify all of the expense report at the end of the month. It's using Azure Cognitive Services, which means that it does have AI model available. In this case, the AI model doesn't actually use your data to train, because it's a generic image recognition model that Microsoft is using in this case. So they are not saving your data or training it with your specific data. At the moment, it's only available in the US, but I am really hoping it will come to Europe as well. Electronic invoices, I mentioned this before because this is one of the things where I think that the standardized microservice is actually a really good idea, because when we talk about electronic invoicing, especially to governments, these are standard formats. They are mostly using like PEPL or some of these standard format for electronic invoices, which means that there is no point in the customer or the partner actually customizing these invoice format, because they should be fairly static. And if they are fairly static, then Microsoft could actually develop them for you and have them available out of the box, which is really cool. because it will save you a lot of money in the actual implementation project, because that documents, external documents and so on, is actually something that normally costs a lot in the implementation project. So it's an important part in keeping the cost down as well. This also requires the RCS setup, as I discussed before. You will be able to generate documents in multiple different formats. You can use XML, you can use JavaScript object notation, JSON, text documents, comma-separated files. And one of the actual good things here is that it actually connects directly to web services to deliver these invoices as well. You can actually, in the Dynamics, actually set up the specific endpoint where to send these invoices, which is also a good point, because you don't have to have other integration engines for this. The inventory visibility one is an important one when it comes to retail. So if you, for instance, have an external system that reads retail data, or you actually have an external retail system or a warehouse system where you need to actually understand inventory. If you have an external e-commerce solution, you can actually use this, because this is an API towards the retail component. So this actually creates a RESTful API that you can use to surface and access the inventory and the warehouse status for specific products in this case, which is makes it really, really easy if you're not using Microsoft's own commerce engine, for instance. The cool thing here is that this interface is actually both read and write. So it's not only reading information, you can actually reserve things using this API as well. So if you have a e-commerce solution and someone orders something, you can actually put in a reservation towards the inventory, waiting for the actual transaction to come into the system and take up that reservation in this case. So that's really interesting as well. Okay, so to start summarizing a bit, as you might have understood, I think this is actually a good step. It's a good thing to build smaller, less expensive, easier to maintain components, which is outside of Dynamics. So if you have a service that you need to build, where you in maybe AX 2012 would have built it inside of AX, I've seen examples of people having entire route planning systems for delivery trucks built into AX 2012. Maybe not the optimal way to do it. So I would say rather build it outside. Use the components that are available from cloud vendors anywhere. Build it as a separate entity, because that way you can actually update it on your own schedule. You don't have to take Microsoft's update into account. You don't have to take changes that the partner does into account, as long as you have a well-defined API. And also try to use the standard APIs that are available within Dynamics. I mean, you could use, for instance, OData. If it's smaller amounts of data, you could use the data management framework. If it's more bulk load of data, when it comes to reading data from Dynamics, I mean, use Datalake. You have data available there, so you could actually read it directly from Datalake instead of, as you did before, maybe using the bring your own database solution. But I mean, you could still create like a custom service if DMF or OData or that is not enough. You could of course build a custom service using JSON and SOAP interfaces. But as I said, please try to keep the functionality outside of the system. There are a couple of other reasons as well for keeping it outside of the system. Maybe we have a solution which is not really suited to be in Dynamics, or maybe we should actually we actually want to try to replace functionality. So I have an example from a customer that had a system, and they wanted to acquire orders. They had telemarketers that were on the phone that were actually collecting orders, and the problem here was that the order receiving was very, very quick, and they were worried a bit that maybe Dynamics standard interface was not really up to speed here. So they actually thought about building an external order system, which actually then integrated into Dynamics to send the orders back into Dynamics. So that actually might be a solution where you think that this functionality might not make that much sense within Dynamics. So in that case, we could actually move it out of the core system in this case. So how do we do this? There are a couple of things. I would discuss mostly Azure applications right now. We have the Service Bus, we have Event Hub, we have Event Grid for making message-based integrations and message-based microservices. We also have Logic Apps, which we can use. Logic Apps, for you who don't know, is the small brother of Power Platform, Power Automate. If you want to build code, if you need to build code, there are a couple of different options for you. You can actually host them. You can either host them in an Azure function, which is made to host smaller chunks of code, just small functions that you can call, and then they can return something to you. But if you want to host more complex solutions, you can actually use like Service Fabric or Docker or something like that. I have an example of a customer that actually built small integration components to sit between CRM, ERP, e-commerce, just to integrate them all together. And they actually built the small integration components by themselves, all in Service Fabric in this case. So there is also an option. So small summary then before we're done for today. So there are some challenges when it comes to the microservices. I actually had a colleague of mine reading through this presentation, and her first question, she's not a technical person, she's a business person. First thing she said was that, okay, so what if we need to customize or update or fix a problem with the microservices? So the point of the microservices is actually that they are standalone. They are a black box. You send something in, you get something out, and most of the times you're not able to customize them. And that's sort of the point, because the whole point is to get less code to maintain in this case. So moving it out into a microservice is a good thing, and as long as you keep the interfaces clean, it should not be a problem. There could be issues troubleshooting those, because in some cases I've been setting some of these up, and I wouldn't say that LCS is an abundance of information when it comes to troubleshooting these microservices, but I'm really, really hoping that this will get better going forward, or that it won't be necessary, because sometimes it is a bit tricky. As I said before, customization is always is maybe never the option in this case. So in the cases where you need different functionality, maybe the microservice is not optimal. But I would argue that in those cases, maybe you should look into the business processes as well. Is there some way we can tweak our business processes to accommodate the microservice, because it really, I mean, every line of code is code that you need to maintain going forward. So having less code to maintain is a good thing. Performance. So what if we have a microservice that is not performing the way we want it? Yes, in those cases, we actually need to send a support request to Microsoft. We actually need to tell them that this is not performing the way we need or the way we want. And in those cases, they need to take that into account as well. And of course, the trust. I mean, can we trust Microsoft to keep these services up and running and working as well as we want them to? I would say most of the times, yes. I mean, that's the same question that we have for more or less any kind of cloud service. I mean, if we put our trust in it, hopefully it will get better, and the problems will be less. And we tend sometimes to forget that even if we are hosting these things ourselves, or we're building these things ourselves, things actually go wrong at that point as well. So what's the upsides of the microservices for businesses? So less code, of course. We don't need to maintain all the code that Microsoft moves out. First of all, we don't need to maintain it. Second of all, we can ignore dependencies, because the code that is outside in the microservices actually doesn't affect our code. And that's a good thing, because that means that if we do a change, other things are less likely to break in this case. New functionality. Microsoft will be delivering more of these microservices, which means that the product in itself will become better, faster, because we move the performance out of Dynamics. And also they can iterate on these microservices faster than they can on the actual Dynamics platform, because in the Dynamics platform, they do have the dependencies to partner and customer code, which it's an important part. And of course, performance. The more things we can move out of Dynamics, the more Azure power we can use to perform this functionality faster. And it doesn't put strain on our existing Dynamics 365 solution in this case. So that's everything I had for today. Thank you for DynamicsCon for letting me do this presentation. It's always fun to speak to people and to try to communicate the things I know. We now go into the Q&A. If you have any questions that you haven't already written down in the chat, please add them to the chat and I will be here to answer all of them for you.
Hello, I'm hoping everyone can hear me correctly here. So thank you for attending my session and looking into the material. I am going to take a few of the questions that were delivered in the chat during the session. So first of all, Jake, I will start with your question about seeing the microservices in practice. So the data lake is absolutely one of those. I have customers that have actually set it up and syncing data to data lakes already, even though it's not even if it was not in full GA yet. The reason for that is that since we're not pushing any data in, it's fairly safe to use it anyway. They mostly use it for analytics and stuff. So I would absolutely think that this is a good idea, definitely. I was also part of setting up the finance insights as a proof of concept at the customer that I was related to before. So yes, I have used them in practice. So next question in the list is Alexander. Is Microsoft going to make these microservices extensible for ISVs? If they're not extensible, ISVs will become more limited. So I would say that there will be some points of extension. So if we, for instance, take a look at the Finance Insights one, what we can do there is that we can actually affect the model, the AI model that is being used to understand how the customers handle their payments and so on. We can tweak it to our data, even if we can even not use the standard model, and we can build our own as well. So that is also an option. But what I understand, this is mostly, as I said in the session, actually a black box, where this is the point of this is actually that we don't need to do any work on this. We don't need to make many extensions to it. There is, of course, the options to build your own microservices to be able to use Datalake and Dataverse and so on to get the data out and build similar functionality. But I sort of think that the Microsoft services in themselves are thought to be more out of the box, if that answers your questions. So the next question is from Jake. These are great for performance and scalability, but it seems like it's somewhat limiting because you don't really have visibility into what is happening, how they work, or the ability to change them. Yeah, I totally agree with you, but I'm sort of the point that companies tend to customize things a little too easy. Because the problem with customizations and modifications are that we need to handle them, we need to manage them, and in those cases, maybe we shouldn't try to customize everything that we see. That's my personal view on this. I know that there are other companies not really doing this, but so I actually think that it's a good thing that they are fairly static, so to speak. So how are microservices orchestrated? If the microservices update automatically, how compatibility is ensured with F&O version? So I would say I don't have any real insight on this, but as far as I understand it, these microservices are deployed through LCS, which means that, and they are deployed per environment, which means that they are very much aware of which version you're using. But what I also think is that they are trying to use as static APIs as possible to not change the interaction between the microservice and the things around them. Not to have to really be forced to do the updates as you update the F&O environment, if that makes sense. Okay, so next question, Gustav. Do we know anything about geo availability? Do the microservices always need to be deployed in the same region? I would say yes at the moment, because the microservices are deployed through LCS, and you are not today able to do any kind of customizations in deciding which regions they are going to be set up. So the dedicated ones for F&O are actually the ones that will be forced to use the same region as your environment. And I think also that has to do with latency and so on, to minimize network traffic between regions. Sorry, I skipped Alexander. Alexander Evans writes, I'm skeptical about customer limiting their business processes to what comes from these microservices out of the box. Yeah, I totally agree with you. But as I said before, I'm sort of my mind is more to the point that maybe we should. And I know that this from an AX perspective, this is a bit controversial, but I mean, my question to customers, and I'm just a technician. I don't work with the actual business processes, but my question to customers usually is: so when you install Office, how many customizations do you do in Office? How much do you customize Windows? Most of the times you don't. So my follow-up question there is, okay, so how do they support your business processes? Yeah, we probably need to adjust our business processes to the application. And I would say that in some cases, maybe we should do the same when it comes to the ERP system. But as I said, this is just my point of view, because I also realize that it's very expensive to do customizations, because those needs to be maintained and supported forever, so to speak. Okay, so Shiva Kumar, Johan, thanks for the information. Can you expand on the IoT integration for asset management module? Can you share some additional references material to this point? Yeah, so there are a couple of links at the Microsoft Docs sites. So these are mainly for getting information into AX to make decisions on production and so on. I would try to put some information in the chat about what you can actually do with it. I don't really know exactly if I can use this chat after the session, but I will try to get it as soon as possible after the session is done, and you can pick it up there. Okay, so Nancy Cruz Clark, wondering if we update, does it break current workflows? As I said before, since the whole point of the architecture here is to have it like a black box and to actually decrease dependencies, I would say my spontaneous answer is no. These are fairly new, so we haven't really had that much experience with them yet. But I would say that the whole point in building them is to cut down the dependencies and make it easier. So I hope that answers your question. So Cruz, let's see here. Do you think we can expect more microservices delivered by Microsoft? I would say most definitely. I would say that we will get more of them as soon as Microsoft sees new features which actually in a fairly easy way can break out of the system. I think that is really, really important. And also to the updatability and serviceability of the main core product actually. So Ajit, great session. My question is around documentation around microservices. Docs is one obvious area, but do we have another sources which we need to look at when attempting to POC with microservices? So the thing here is that most of the microservices are in some kind of preview, more or less, and that means that documentation is a bit sparse. I would say that the main source for getting information about these microservices is actually the Microsoft Dynamics Insider Yammer groups, because there we have access to product managers, we have access to people who are actually doing development in the microservices. So I really think that this is really important. All right, so I'll try to do a couple more because we have 5 minutes left for this Q&A. So Jake, you can use the chat or you can join Dynamics. Okay, thank you. All right, so Jane. Okay, so that means that we probably made it through all the questions. So is there anything else that you would like to ask before we leave off? We have 4 minutes left of the Q&A, as far as I understand. All right, I hope I successfully answered all of your questions, and I will try to get you the documentation, the links to the docs session about the IoT things, and as I said before, the most important source of information here is probably the Dynamics Insider Yammer groups, because that's where I get a lot of the information. All right. Thanks everyone, and hope you had a great session, and hope you have a great continuation of the conference.